Thank you again. The Governor has agreed to stay and take some questions. We're very fortunate to have that opportunity. A few housekeeping rules. When asking a question, please raise your hand. A microphone will be brought to you. Please tell us your name and organisation. And if I could ask people to refrain from making long comments, just a brief question, so that we give everybody an opportunity to ask a question. Of course, that rule about not making long comments doesn't apply to me. Anyway, look, let me, if I can just start with a few things. Sorry, I should also mention we have questions from the live stream that we're coming through on the iPad. I'll also be reading off some of those. So, Governor, if I can just start with an opener. Thank you again for your thoughts on those issues, and you talked a lot about trust. One of the things you talked about was the importance of productivity gains and innovation in business. It's a really interesting debate to have in a concept where we want to talk about wage growth, we want to talk about full employment and innovation in business, which can so often be confused for job losses in the individual sense. In a global sense, people can see the benefits of it, but individually it can impact people. So I just wonder whether you have an observation on that whole question of innovation and how we actually have that conversation or debate with the wider community about the benefits.
Well, if you think about kind of where the growth in the Australian economy is going to come over the next 20 years, it's going to come from businesses finding better way of doing things. You know, we've become an incredibly prosperous country largely because of what's on our land and what's under the land. You know, and that's been the source of our comparative advantage for many, many years. If you think kind of by the time my kids are my age, the comparative, if we're going to enjoy really high living standards, because what's in our brains. So we've got to find a way of kind of developing ideas and commercialising them in a way that we have not done. I think our future success depends on us doing that. How best business does it, I don't know. I think the innovation that's occurring though is causing kind of uncertainty, as you say, in parts of the workforce, because there's a lot of job churn going on. It's interesting because the unemployment rates, as I said in my remarks, around the world are the lowest they've been in decades. 30, 40, 50 years in some countries. Yet people don't feel happy, and I think it's because they see this innovation, they see a lot of change because of technology, and they're worried about the future. So I'm not sure what the solution there is, but we've got to find a way of keeping the ideas generation and innovation going and giving people confidence that that can coexist with improving living standards. And this is why I'm so focused on wages, because that's the way that these things can connect. And
I might just switch gears for a moment and just talk about the importance of resilience in the economy more broadly. We're 10 years on from the collapse of Lehman Brothers. I think the Australian Treasury Secretary noted just on the weekend that excessive leverage fundamentally sits behind most major crises. And I just wondered whether you have any observations about how you think the Australian economy, and perhaps more broadly the international economy, is placed in the, should there be another shock event such as there was 10 years ago?
Yeah. If you get hit by a shock, the one thing you want to have is the buffers against that shock. So you can think of buffers coming in a number of dimensions. Buffers in the financial sector, and they're stronger than they have been any time for a long time. So the amount of capital and liquidity that the banking system has globally is much better. So that's a positive development and gives us some extra degree of resilience. Another buffer you can have is on the fiscal front. And here the story is not good at all. In Australia it's reasonable. It's probable we'll get back to a budget surplus this year or next or the one after. So, and the level of public debt is low. So if we got hit by another shock, the Australian government still could use its balance sheet to stimulate the economy. In many other countries, that's not the case. The US is a very good example at the moment. Public debt's extraordinarily high and the budget deficits have increased, and they're going to have budget deficits of 5% of GDP for as far as you can see. So the the buffers in public sector balance sheets around the world are much, much reduced, which I think is a major concern. It's almost like the idea of building, paying an insurance premium in the good times has become unfashionable. We assume the bad times won't return and we don't need to pay the insurance. Fortunately, that hasn't been the case in Australia. The third set of buffers are really in private sector balance sheets. A downturn, if you can borrow more, then you can smooth your consumption or firms can keep on investing. Corporate debt in many countries has increased a lot. So there's less ability there, and household debt levels, including Australia, are much higher. So there's less resilience in private sector balance sheets and in government balance sheets, but there's more resilience in financial sector balance sheets. So it's a kind of a mixed picture. But we need to build buffers in the system. That's the best thing. We need to pay insurance premiums in good times. And actually, it's good times now. Growth of 3.5%, unemployment of 5%, inflation low and stable at 2%. This is the time we should be building buffers in the system. We are kind of doing that in Australia, but not everywhere else in the world.
Speaking of the rest of the world, I know as part of your role, you spend a lot of time talking with your counterparts the governors of the other banks. I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about what is on their mind in terms of the issues that are concerning them.
There are a few. One would be the escalation of the trade tensions between the United States and China. I think what we're seeing to date is it's highly regrettable, but it's manageable. The higher tariffs will lead to slower growth in China and in the US and in the rest of Asia, and we're starting to see some of the ripple effects of that now. But it's possible that those tensions escalate. I understand at the moment the Chinese are unhappy about the US tariffs. That's, you can understand why they are. But the Americans also have some grievances, and they centre around the protection of intellectual property rights in China, very large state subsidies, and state-owned enterprises buying assets elsewhere around the world. So the Americans have some legitimate concerns. How those concerns ultimately get resolved, it's a really big issue, and we all have a very strong interest in those concerns being resolved in a constructive way, but there is a big question mark over whether that will happen. So that's one set of issues. Another, over recent times, although it's a bit less now, is why wages aren't growing. This is one of the issues we talk a lot about in our meetings in Basel. In the US, the unemployment rate's down to where it was in 1969, and it's only just recently that wages have picked up. So why that's the case, why wages haven't been growing, and what's going to change, and is it possible that we get to a point where wages start rising very quickly, just because they haven't risen for a long period of time, the labour markets are very tight, and what the implications of that would be. So they're the broad issues we've been grappling with.
I don't want this to sound like a cultural cringe question, but when you're at those meetings, what is the view back from those governors about the Australian economy?
Well, it's always been a very positive one. The standard question I get asked at these meetings is, can you tell me why Australia's done so well for so long? What are the keys?
A good reserve bank, is that your answer?
So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons I give, including strong public institutions, including the central bank, strong population growth, our links with Asia, a proud history of economic reform. So there are a lot of positives for me to talk about at those meetings. I only hope in 5 years' time I've got the same story to tell.
You mentioned strong population growth. The migration debate is on the agenda. Well, it's probably never really been off the agenda, and I just wonder whether you have a comment about that and the possibility of a slowing in that migration growth and the broader impact they may have on productivity.
Well, I don't think it's going to have very much impact on productivity in the short run, but the strong population growth has been an important driver of Australia's economic growth. The population at the moment is rising a bit faster than 1.5%, and that's one reason over a long period of time we haven't had a technical recession, because each year more and more people are living in this country, and that's driving growth. So I think that's been an important factor. I also think it's had a positive spin-off in the fact that it's made our society, our country, much more diverse. In the most recent census, 50% of the population either had one parent born overseas or born overseas themselves. So there's no other Western country that can claim to kind of have such a large share of the population with foreign ancestry. And people come here, by and large, they're industrious, they're trying to make a better life for themselves and their family, and they often have business links back to it. So that's been an incredible positive for the Australian economy. As I gave a speech earlier this year, it's changed our demographics as well. We used to be in terms of kind of ageing, we were ageing pretty much like the rest of the world, and we were going to become an old society fairly quickly. That's changed around. So we are now one of the youngest Western countries, and we're going to stay young for quite a while because we've had a lot of people come in their 20s, live in Australia, work, become part of productive members of the society. So that's very positive. I think that the negative is the pressure on infrastructure. And this has been a problem for many, many years. We have not invested enough in infrastructure to deal with the rising population, and it's causing many in the community to be unhappy and often to blame immigration, when the underlying problem is underinvestment in infrastructure, which we're now finally addressing. Whether we're going to do it quickly enough, I don't know, but it's... The economy can certainly cope with a cut in the current rate of immigration, and that may help deal with infrastructure problems, but the underlying point is that immigration has been very good for this country.
I will keep asking questions, but if you do have a question, please feel free to put up your hand and someone will come around. I think there might be one out there. In fact, why don't we take that one now?
Governor, Paul Hislop from ACL and Consulting. You stressed the issue of trust and the importance of trust in institutions for the stability of the financial system. Wouldn't it be fair to say that's a more centrally planned sort of view of the world? And wouldn't it be better to focus more on trying to encourage more scepticism amongst people of people's behaviour? And wouldn't that also be consistent with improving educational standards?
I wouldn't agree with the idea that trust is a kind of a centrally planned concept. And trust is is central to every transaction between two people, whether it's a kind of a business transaction or a personal transaction. And my perspective is that a lack of trust diminishes the productivity of the economy and the constructive nature of transactions between people and businesses. So I think it's incredibly important concept in a market-based economy. It's important in finance, it's important in general business, and it's important in the political sphere. I think there's enough scepticism out there. We need to, trust shouldn't be given blindly, it needs to be earned. As I said in my remarks, all those in who trust has been placed need to do everything they can to be worthy of that trust. Businesses need to be, public officials need to be, financial institutions need to be.
Thank you very much for your speech, Governor. This is not an economic speech. I'm Liz Cohen from CARA, a disability organisation, but one of leadership. You spoke about trust in your speech, and I'm aware you have built a strong culture of trust, loyalty and respect within the Reserve Bank. Can you share how you embedded this culture?
Well, for an organisation like the Reserve Bank, I'd say it's relatively easy because our mandate is low inflation, full employment and the welfare of the Australian people. So the essence of our organisation is serving the public interest. So we talk about that a lot internally. We're not driven by profit. We don't have short-term remuneration incentives. We're driven by serving the public interest. So we talk a lot about that internally. As I said, it's our first core internal value, and we keep repeating these ideas over and over. We're here to serve the public. We're here to promote the welfare of the 25 million people we serve. And I think that messaging kind of gradually gets through and becomes part of the culture, and people feel that's what they're here to do in my organisation. We're here to serve the public. And so that consistent messaging, I think, is really important. And in private financial institutions, there's obviously different messaging, but I think service needs to be part of the messaging going forward. We're here to service our customers because the financial sector is kind of incredibly important for the economy, and it's all about service. And that needs to be the constant messaging in financial institutions. We're here to serve the people that trust us.
Picking up on the Royal Commission, you talked about needing to change the way that some of the conduct has been found in the Royal Commission, but you also mentioned you are very concerned about the impact of the Royal Commission on the stability of the banking system. Are you confident that we can get that balance right, addressing the instances of poor behaviour, but also protecting the stability of the banking system?
Yeah. Well, I'm confident that in the end we'll get to a better place on conduct. There were too many examples that the Royal Commission has highlighted where the conduct was not up to scratch and the penalties weren't strong enough, and we'll fix that. Who knows what the nature of that fix is, but I'm confident we'll get through that. My current concern more is about credit supply. A few years ago, credit standards were way too loose, and there's been a correction of that, but I'm starting to be a bit concerned the pendulum might be swinging a bit too far the other way. We need financial institutions to take risk, and that means lending to some people who actually can't pay the money back. Some share of the borrowers will not be able to pay back, but if banks become very scared to make loans to people who may not, under some circumstances, be able to pay the loan back, credit supply in the economy will diminish, and that will hurt the economy. So the pendulum has swung from credit supply being too generous, perhaps to credit supply being a bit tight, and I'm hoping in time it will come back to more centre. So we're watching the ability of financial institutions to provide credit very carefully.
Do you think in that debate and in that striving to get that balance right, there is an important role for the capital markets? I mean, there is a debate about the long-term value of the franchise, which you talked about, being properly weighed against short-term gains. But it's often the capital markets that are driving that short-term focus. So is there some role, and I don't know what the role is, but do we need to also address that focus of the market to be able to make these longer changes?
Perhaps. I'm not sure where the short-term incentive, the incentive for short-termism financial institutions come from. Some people say it's the management, and other people say it's the underlying investors in the equity. They're kind of demanding good returns every quarter. I'm not sure where the balance there is. One other point on the capital markets, though. I think at the moment the capital markets can provide a safety valve for if banks become too tight in their credit supply. Some firms can go to the capital markets, so it's a safety valve in a way, but only large firms can do that. So my particular concern at the moment is the supply of credit to small business. Many bankers tell me they're unsure about how the responsible lending laws apply to small business loans, and so they're taking, in some cases, a very conservative approach because the risk management people and the lawyers with inside financial institutions say, look, do every piece of due diligence you can and then maybe do some more before you make the loan. So the supply of credit to small business, I think, has tightened up, and the capital markets are not a safety valve for that. They're a safety valve for large business, but not for small business. So I think we need to watch the supply of credit to small business very carefully.
I think there was a question here at the... sorry, just there.
Hey, Governor, this is Anthony Ross from Chartered Accountants Australia, New Zealand. You spoke about building buffers into the system. I'd really love to know about Australia's gold reserves. So when the RBA plans to do another audit on our gold reserves, and with 99.9% of our current gold reserves in the Bank of England, whether the RBA has a plan to bring any of them back to Australia?
No, we don't. We do regular audits of our gold reserves to make sure all there and accounted for, and I can report that every audit is, we get a clean bill of health there. We keep the gold reserves in London, because that's where the centre of the gold lending market is. By able to kind of lend out our gold temporarily, we can earn a small incremental return on it and cover some of the costs of holding those reserves. So I think it's kind of the right place for the gold to be. We don't have any plans to sell any more, to buy any more, or to bring it back to Australia.
At the back? Yes, sorry, yep.
Governor, Michael Heath from Bloomberg News. The standard estimate, I guess, for full employment has been 5%, which we've now reached. And obviously the global experience is that countries are having to go much lower than their normal or traditional full employment or NAIRU to get wage growth. We're sort of seeing it in the US. Do you have an estimate now for what the new level would be in Australia? Is it 4% now, or 3.5% or 4.5%? Have you got that far?
No, I don't have a new estimate. I mean, the number of 5% was kind of a conventional estimate coming from various modelling approaches. I never had particular adherence to that as kind of being the true answer. It's interesting, in New South Wales at the moment, the unemployment rate is 4.4%. I think here in Victoria it's 4.6%. And in both states, the rate of wage growth is kind of 2.3 or 2.4. So we're seeing in the two biggest states be able to sit with an unemployment rate around 4.5% and that not cause wages to accelerate. I suspect nationally we could sit around 4.5% without seeing wage growth pick up by too much. So I certainly hope that's the case, and we'll have to wait and see. But we're gradually inching down and testing how far we can go without wage growth accelerating too quickly. Our underlying strategy is to have the labour market tighten up to get wages to pick up. Inflation picks up closer to 2.5% and real wages increase as well. So that's our strategy, and I think we can go lower than 5%, and I certainly hope so.
Might just take one or two more questions. One at the front.
Governor, it's Michael Stanford, Non-Exec Director on various company boards. It's a great topic, really well expressed. A long time ago I was taught that trust is built from openness and spontaneity. Tonight you were very open. I suspect it might be at times at 2 a.m. you'd love to push out a tweet with your personal Philip Lowe view. But you represent an organisation and a broader purpose, and everybody hangs off every word and the spaces between words. How do you balance your personal thoughts with the organisational thoughts and yet maintain trust?
Well, I don't have a Twitter account, so that's you can rest assured that I won't be sending out. Most of the time, I don't have particular trouble balancing the organisational thoughts with my personal thoughts, because by nature, if something comes into my mind, I'm inclined to say it. I have to, curate around the edges, but I don't find that a kind of a particular difficulty. As a public official and an independent public official, I feel like I can speak my mind almost always, not in every case, but pretty much always. I try and steer clear of making overtly political comments, but I do try and make analytical comments on topics, even if they're not convenient for the government or the opposition at the time. So that's how I balance these things.
Staying with technology, I have a question coming through on the iPad where Alex asks, does the recent instability of federal leadership impact on any of the RBA strategies?
Well, the short answer to that is no. Business confidence is high. Well, that's business are investing and they're employing people. I think that's the most important thing. It's perhaps a sad thing to say, but many in the community have got used to the political turmoil in Canberra. When we had the first rotations of leadership a number of years ago, every business meeting I went to, that's all anyone wanted to talk about. Now they don't talk about it so much. Unfortunately, we've got used to it, and businesses are going on and investing and hiring people as they should be.
Last question, perhaps I'll just end. Oh, there's one more. Sorry, there's one more there, sorry.
Thank you. Rob Fowler from HESTA. Governor, you've talked about the linkage between the unemployment rate and the hope that the wages growth rate will increase as unemployment come down. What discussions has the RBA had about the effect of casualisation? Because we were talking about at the table and the effect it's having on people's savings. I'm just wondering whether or not you have any observations as to how that linkage between the two may well be impacting what would normally be a fairly strong linkage between lower unemployment and a growing wage rate.
I think it's probably had some role, but I wouldn't overstate it, because the best data that we can get says there's been an increase in casualisation, but it's a fairly small change. The vast bulk of people still have permanent jobs. Two-thirds of the labour force have full-time jobs, and a third have part-time jobs, and most of the people who are working part-time are happy with the hours they're working part-time. There has been some increase in casualisation, but I wouldn't overstate it. There are deeper things going on, and they're global in nature, because this concern about the lack of real wage growth is central to kind of almost every Western economy, which suggests there are global factors at work. That we often look for Australian-specific things, but I don't think that's the right place to be looking. And my take on it is it's a combination of globalisation and technology. Everyone feels like there's a bit more competition out there, and globalisation and technology also make you more uncertain about the future. So you feel like there's more competition and you're more uncertain. The result of that is you feel like you've got less pricing power. And businesses feel that, and workers feel like that as well. The example I'm fond of quoting at the moment is a professional services firm in Sydney has outsourced the PAs to some of their senior executives to a facility in Manila. And they're able to do, and they say, well, this is just as efficient rather than having the PA sit next door to you. To have an app on your computer, you tap on the app and your PA can appear there in Manila, and you can talk to your PA and pass instructions and information, and that's just as efficient. The result of that is there's less upward pressure on the wages of PAs in Sydney. In the first wave of kind of globalisation, it was manufacturing workers that felt the pressure. But now, because of technology and globalisation, white-collar workers in Sydney and Melbourne feel that same pressure that manufacturing workers in the US felt with the liberalisation of the trade market. So white-collar workers everywhere, right around the world, feel like there's more competition for their job because of technology and globalisation, and they also feel a bit more uncertain about the future because of all this kind of innovation and structural change going on. I think that's at the heart of the issue, the kind of the uncertainty and the perceptions of greater competition. And there's other issues about casualisation playing some role, but it's not the main story. As I said before, our strategy at the Reserve Bank is to keep interest rates low, to have the labour market tighten up so that people will get over these concerns about competition, firms will get over it, workers will get over it, and we'll see an increase in income growth for the household sector, which will be good for consumption, be good for people paying back debts, and I think it would be good for political discourse as well.
Last question, which you can have a one-word answer to. Whenever we have these evenings, we always talk about housing affordability. 2 years ago, we were talking about increasing prices. Tonight, we were talking about decreasing prices. When we are back here in 2 years' time, would you care to forecast what? I have to work out whether I've got to buy something.
I don't give forecasts. Can I choose option C? I hope that'd be stable.
Yeah. Good.
Because as I showed in my graph, that the prices in Sydney and Melbourne got extraordinarily high, and 18 months ago, the biggest political issue in the country was housing affordability. People were saying, how can my kids ever afford housing? People with mortgage stress. It was the biggest political issue in the country. The budget last year was framed around improving housing affordability. 18 months on, prices have come down, and certain sections of the community think this is kind of a disaster, but it does mean housing is more affordable, more young families and more individuals can get into housing, which is a good thing. And if we continued on the previous track, we were going to end up with big problems. The adjustment we're having is manageable. The IMF, you might have noticed today, put out a statement after its long mission to Australia, and they said the cooling of the housing market is welcome and it can be weathered in a strong economy like we have in Australia. The correction's orderly and I expect it will stay that way. There are downside risks, but the background in which this adjustment is occurring is a fairly benign one. Low unemployment declining, interest rates are low, they're likely to stay low. The economy is doing well, businesses are investing and hiring people, and population is growing strongly, and we don't have oversupply in the market, except for in some very small locations. So the general background in which we're having this adjustment, I think, is a positive one, and I think it's entirely manageable.